Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk about art, okay, let's rewind a little bit. So in this video, I wish to touch a little bit on another practical aspect, I guess, of if you remember my one of the previous videos about the analyzing double slit experiment, where I've shown how the networks of power / science / culture / ideas that I frequently talk about in abstract sense manifest directly in actual physical experiments. So here I wish to show the same process manifesting itself in art, and more narrowly what is called temporal art, and even more narrowly what is called movies, right? Or, well, like popular culture, and in particular movies. Okay, like cinema in general as a cultural phenomenon. So this video is about that. But it's, again, it has broader implications for other genres probably as well, but I wouldn't focus on that. So, let me give you a general scheme of what is happening, what I'm going to talk about. It's going to be a very abstract introduction, but then we'll proceed closer and closer to factual things, okay? So, in case you weren't aware of that, of what I've been talking about in my previous videos, I've many a time talked about how networks have replaced, and not only me, it's not my original idea, right? I'm just following the leading thinkers of the last decades. So networks have replaced hierarchies in culture, okay? And network is a very different thing. It's a, roughly speaking, horizontally organized structure, kind of like a root system, versus hierarchy, which is like pyramid-like, you know. So there's something on top and everything on bottom is working on this thing which is on top, okay? So networks are replacing hierarchies, okay? That's first point. And the second point in this abstract block is that we have analogies between space and time, if you know what I mean. So let me clarify a little bit. We actually, in our culture, Western culture, probably, but I think it can be more or less generalized, tend to represent time as space. So we tend to think of time as an arrow, you know, as something like continuous succession of moments of time, right? So it's a spatial thing almost, right? In our kind of mind's eye, so to speak, right? And therefore, analogies can be made in events or other phenomena that arise in space with phenomena that arise in time. And I've actually made this comment in one of my videos where I've had a Skype talk with my friends from alternative science community. I'll give the link in the description. I don't want to waste time on that. But there I give an analogy of like cycles in time as crystals in space. There's a very clear analogy between them, okay? But okay, for the sake of this discussion, what I'm saying is, in space, we can represent a hierarchy easily, again, like a pyramid, for example, right? There's something on top, there's something supporting it at the bottom, right? And it kind of rises up to this larger top type of thing, right? So this is a easy representation of a hierarchy in space. But you can claim that in art, especially temporal arts, such as music, literature, and film, cinema, of course, you can also make a claim that some paintings can also have, like any art actually has a temporal component to it. Like if you look at the painting, you can say there is always some dynamic to it. Like an absolute minority of paintings have no dynamic to it, right? There's always like some motion, like implied through the poses, the gestures, the distribution of contrast, the distribution of masses. Like if you paint like the hero in very bright colors and everything else in very dark colors, there's a clear dynamic because of that, because there's like clear contradiction between them. Or you paint a lot of stuff on one side of the painting and very minor amount of stuff on the other. There's a clear dynamic, like this large amount of stuff is gonna fall there, blah blah blah. Okay, I'm digressing. So temporal arts are, again, music, literature, and cinema. So because they have to be consumed in time, and they actually like make their point in time, whereas painting is inherently static, or like sculpture is inherently static, etc., etc. Okay, so I already forgotten what I was talking about. Oh yeah, so in art we have in temporal arts, we have what is called the Freytag pyramid. I've already talked about it in my video Stories of History, where I've tried to apply it to historical narratives, or historical probably is the proper adverb. Is that a proper word? I don't know. So, okay. Freytag pyramid. So, what is it about? And notice how is it called? It is called literally a pyramid, so it implies a hierarchy, and it's very easy to show that it is. Like we have I'll actually show it to you on the screen right now. Like there it is. So we have an intro where you have like an exposure to the actors, etc., like whoever is doing stuff. Then you have like a rise, like things are getting more and more tense. Then you have a climax, which is like the most important part of the story. Then you have a fall, which is like the consequences of the climax. And then you have what the Freytag called the catastrophe, but it literally means like the end of things, right? Like the end of story, basically. Like whatever fallout we have from the climax, right? But the climax clearly has a sort of a privileged state in this sort of arrangement. So you can clearly see how we had sort of a, how do you call it, like a communistic, arrow of time. Every moment in time is the same. The energy is conserved, if you know what I mean. That's a very, very third grade, like B type of humor here. Okay. Anyway, we have an arrow of time, which is kind of flat, but then you kind of take some very important event in this arrow of time and you kind of pull it upwards, and therefore your arrow becomes like a pyramid, right? You have the preceding events and following events, and this very important event on the top of it. So time in this sense also becomes like a hierarchical system. And this is our story. This is what is usually understood, like in previous times, by the plot, how things progress in a classical narrative, you would say. You could say, I should have said. Alright, so this pyramid clearly resembles, not just resembles, represents a hierarchy where, again, climax rules over everything before it and everything after it, because everything before it is only interesting to us as much as it leads to climax, right? So an author, whoever it is or whichever it is, should only leave the important parts, the relevant parts, to the climax, right? And again, the fallout, so to speak, the downfall of the tension should only be as relevant as it is related to the climax, so to speak. So basically the whole story revolves around this climax. So we only tell what leads to it and we only tell what follows from it. So climax clearly leads the way, so to speak. Okay? And it's kind of easy to understand, like, think about, like, I don't know, like random story, like Matrix, like Neo. Like, why do they even show in the movie like the preceding story of Neo, how he worked at the office, how he like slept at his computer, etc. Like it is irrelevant to the story to some degree. But since later he arrived at the Matrix, done some weird shit there, like saved the world, became the one, blah blah blah, so that was the climax, the main point of the story, if you wish. And therefore we need to actually follow him backwards in some sense and show how he arrived to this spot, right? So this preceding narrative, how he was an office worker, is only justified to be told through the lens of this climax. If there would be no climax, there would be no point in telling the story of this random office worker, right? Because he was not random through the eyes of the climax, right? So the climax justifies the preceding story, and obviously, like, everything that follows from climax also deserves to be told because the climax was so cool, if you know what I mean. And not in this particular case, but in general, like, this is the idea. I think it's pretty clear. All right. So that was like the classical picture of things. For good or bad, like, this is what pretty much all stories followed previously. But what happens in modern culture? Like, I've already said that we've now sort of are getting rid of hierarchies. By the way, I've probably did not make this comment previously, but I've said that networks have replaced hierarchies, but this is not entirely the case, because I should rather have said that networks are replacing hierarchies. So hierarchies are still there in some places, but networks are a more generalized thing. And network can actually contain hierarchies inside of it. So therefore, network is inherently more powerful, you might say. All right, so what happens when in art, in this particular case, in the case of cinema even more narrowly, when the hierarchy of Freytag crumbles, this pyramid crumbles, or rather becomes less important, let's say, and we have some sort of network surpassing it. Well, exactly that. Instead of these isolated, you might say, hierarchically organized temporal structures, such as like an isolated plot of Neo in the Matrix, or I don't know, Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars, and what else we can think of? I don't know, Oedipus in Sophocles pieces. What are other famous stories? I don't know, Prince Hamlet in Shakespeare's piece, whatever. So these are all isolated narratives, very, very kind of like made up according to this scheme of Freytag or Freytag. So instead of these isolated hierarchies, we get networks of connected stories. So it's kind of hard to explain, but I hope, like, on some very intuitive level you understand it. So we get sort of like parallel stories, if you know what I mean, like coexisting with each other rather than having a single completely isolated story, right? We think of, okay, there may be another story in the same domain, in the same network, connected to this story, okay? So let's say we have a story of Prince Hamlet, but then we can tell a story of Horatio, or Horatio, whichever you call it, parallel to the story of Prince Hamlet, right? Something like that. And it could as well have its own pyramid, but they would coexist in a broader network, right? The broader network would kind of consume them, or rather, I don't know, feed them together, contain them probably would be a better word. Okay, so we kind of can now, with this new cultural foundation of network-oriented patterns of culture, we can kind of zoom out of this like isolated story, and we kind of it will become very small. Well, of course, for you, it actually becomes larger. So I will do this. It becomes kind of smaller, and we can observe other stories neighboring to it, which also may or may not have this same pyramid-like structure. Okay. And we can observe them as at once as parts of the same network, of larger interconnected network. All right, instead of again focusing on any one of them, like where again the key point of each one of them was the climax, right? So, okay, so hopefully, even though I kind of explained it poorly, but hopefully with some examples it will become clearer. But I hope you get the point, okay? So, coming closer to practice, this is the reason why we observe today, I believe so at least, this universe hysteria, you might say, or universe phenomenon. I mean, like fictional universe, where you have this universe, that universe, this universe, etc. And everything that follows from this phenomenon, like spin-offs, like sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, or remakes, reboots, I don't know the proper stresses, or any sort of mishmash type of stuff, like we have many heroes from these parallel stories in a single story, like united, you know, kind of like a in a musical type of thing, like Avengers. That's the probably the most like a paramount of this type of cultural pattern, I would say. So yeah, we have like Marvel universe, DC universe, we have Star Wars universe, which by the way could have been one of the first examples of this thing. Like really Star Wars kind of brought forth this whole, by the way, watch my video about Star Wars. It's literally called Star Wars on this channel. So it really kind of brought forth this idea of a whole universe, because original like trilogy and prequels even were, by the way, those were already prequels. So okay, original trilogy was just the story of Luke Skywalker. Then they've added prequels, which made the whole story a story of Anakin Skywalker, his father, right? Because he is the only character present in all 6 movies. And ultimately, it's the story about him, right? But then they've expanded it even more to like games, comic books, like fan fiction, whatever. Not even talking about like all the merchandise, like all the toys and stuff. And now they've expanded it even more with 3 like after sequels actually, spin-offs like Rogue One and Solo and blah blah blah, and many more, like the Mandalorian, there's anime, there's all kinds of stuff, right? So this is again probably one of the first examples of this thing, and probably even one of the largest actually to this moment. All right, so it's very typical in this sense. And one thing I wanted to mention, which I've almost forgotten, but it's kind of like a side note, but I wanted to make it, that comic books and their inherent sort of like a hypertextual nature is a very, very fruitful, or rather fertile soil where this kind of cultural patterns can prosper. Because again, as I've already said, like comic books are inherently hypertextual, like everything in a single picture of a comic book, of like a particular comics, kind of relates to everything else simultaneously, right? So it's this hypertextuality, this like self-referencing and everything else referencing, this Bible-like, this Wikipedia-like character, allows comics to be very, very natural environment for networks to prosper, right? Something like that. So in this sense, I'm not surprised at all that Marvel and DC are the best examples. Of course, we have many other ones like Star Trek, we have like Lord of Rings, we have like again Game of Thrones, whatever you wish. Like there are so many of them. Again, as I've said, it's in a way it's a sign of the times, like this sort of thinking. Again, Star Wars, think about that. And of course, there are like economic or economical, not sure, incentives to proceed with that, because corporations that are producing all of this stuff are very happy with it, because, well, in terms of, let's take superhero movies as an example, they can pretty much utilize the same pattern over and over with any superhero. Like, they should show the story how the superhero became a superhero, so it probably was some trauma, some unhappy event, or some accident that made them superhero. They have a segment where they show their superpowers, their super weapon, their fantastic thing that they're famous for. Then they show how they punish there's a separate story of supervillain, of course, how he became or she became or they became a supervillain, then their superpowers, and then we have like an epic battle between the two, and then we have something else, and blah blah blah. So and this pattern can be kind of recycled over and over and over, like unlimited amount of times, right? And then you can unite them all in a single network, right? And like Avengers again, and it all just becomes like a huge whirlwind of these cultural patterns, which are ultimately the same. All right. So it's very, very, very productive for producers themselves, i.e. these big media corporations that make this content. And people are happy as well to some degree, because on one hand, they receive something they are unfamiliar with, let's say new superhero. Like I remember the hype about Deadpool movie, even though actually, like I'll tell you a short story from my personal life. Like one of my friends have asked me when I first went to the US, or maybe the second time, like 2015 or 16, he asked me to buy actual like comic book, like, about Deadpool, and like by then there were no movies about Deadpool, and so he was relatively unknown, but he told me, oh, this is the hero that is kind of breaking the fourth wall, he is so cool, etc., etc. Well, okay, I did it, I brought it back to Belarus, etc. Anyways, so what was I talking about? Yeah, people are happy because on one hand, they receive something probably unknown to them previously, which is like new superhero story or new thing that happens to already known superheroes. And again, on the other hand, they receive something that they already know, which is all these repeating patterns that I've previously described, this like the initiation story of the superhero, the story of their superpowers, the story of how maybe some contradiction with their personal life, like how they should abandon their loved one because they are a superhero, whatever. Like it's all so standardized, so it's really like a factory, just stamping these guys eternally, etc., and like putting them against each other or with each other, etc., etc. So hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. Like okay, let me sort of return back. So instead of these completely isolated islands of pyramids, like these dramatic stories in themselves, we now receive a very, very standardized network where, like, fractal network, if you like, where kind of all the parts relate to the whole in some way, right? For example, in this standardized way of production of a superhero or something to that effect, etc. And yeah. So in some sense, because of that, because we move away from these isolated narratives, hierarchically organized, isolated narratives to these network-oriented narratives, we move from this kind of focused way of like, let's talk about the role of observer, if you wish. So previously we were kind of focused on something, right? We observe the story, we kind of emotionally react to it, etc. And then it ends, and okay, we've left with something probably internally, but we're kind of out of it already. But now with this universe type of stuff, we're up to a broader sort of immersive type of experience, if you know what I mean. Like, we are always in it, if you know what I mean. Like, again, look at all these proverbial, like, American movies where people are fans of something. They have this, like, you know, some sort of like young person in an American movie of like 90s or 2000s, like maybe a nerd or something, and their whole room is like full of this thing that he's into, right? So this is what I'm talking about. This is the universe type of narrative, or rather cultural pattern, where they're always in it and they're consuming everything related to it, and they're almost living this universe's life. They're almost living in this fictional world, right? I'm not judging at all. I'm just stating, right, what's happening and what can happen to some people at least. So we're into this world of immersive experience. And I've recently watched some interview with Martin Scorsese. Probably wasn't even an interview, but it was some public speech of his, the famous director Scorsese, where he said that really cinema is about to change dramatically with these new tendencies, with its new possibilities. So I believe his intuition is correct. I actually remember one phrase of Nietzsche where he said that he was talking about scientists, actually, but it applies to Scorsese, but I think, and like any actually like authorities in anything. So he said that if an old scientist says that something is impossible, he's probably wrong. But if the old scientist, like very old scientist, like old school, thinks that something is possible, something new, I mean, he's probably right. So yeah. So there you go. Even like masters like Scorsese recognize that something is gonna change pretty soon, and it's actually already changing to something else. Like cinema is already transforming into something else. So we have this immersive experience versus focused experience, if you know what I mean. Like, can you imagine? Just like rewind back to what I've said about this nerd's room. Can you imagine this nerd's room like with like a portrait of Shakespeare, like all kinds of merchandise about Prince Hamlet? It's impossible, because like that soil is completely, like the culture is completely transformed with respect to that, right? So like Prince Hamlet and the Marvel universe, like the Iron Man, I might be wrong. Is it Marvel? I don't know. So the Iron Man and Avengers is a completely different thing from Danish Prince Hamlet, right? Like, you cannot like put posters with Hamlet in your room and have figurines of Hamlet and his friends, etc., and his family. Like, it's just impossible. Like, it's just impossible to even imagine. Which means there is a serious transition between those, right? Serious cultural transition. Which is exactly what I'm talking about in this video. And probably one last thing, not last, but okay, several last things to mention is one of the things I wanted to talk about is TV series. I believe it's also a step into this immersive type of realm, right, versus focused type of realm, because TV series kind of are more oriented into putting you into the narrative, like making you an observer for so long that you are actually living inside of this world, right, almost. rather than you're just observing like a story, which is maybe a couple of hours long, and then you go home and then maybe tomorrow you forget about it, only remembering the climax or some things that you were unhappy with or whatever. So yeah, it's a very different realm we're living in, culturally, cinematically. And previously I talked about in one of my videos, or maybe several, music of memes. I definitely, music of memes is my video, where I definitely talked about how new technological advances have allowed us to send like large amounts of multimedia data, including like films and series, TV series, and by TV series I obviously mean like Netflix, Amazon, whatever, like these long narratives, long cinematic narratives, like let's say over 5 hours long, sometimes, I don't know, hundreds of hours long, if you take into account multiple seasons of the same thing. So technological advances we have, which allow us to do that, and we have the cultural foundation, which provides like a serious fertile soil for all of that to happen. So it all works in tandem. So without these tech advances, we wouldn't have things like that, or we would have them in a very truncated form, like very quenched form. But okay, but it all works, and it all is the sign of the times, I would say, okay? And hence, that would be my final comment, or, okay, not final comment. I'll make another comment elsewhere. So, hence the title of this video, The End of the End. What does that mean? Well, I mean that the finished narratives, these hierarchical, isolated narratives, are finished. All right, the finished narratives are finished. So it's the end of the end. Now we don't have the end, even if the parents of Batman were killed and Batman then turned into a millionaire or a billionaire and killed Joker. It's not enough today. Now we need a movie about Joker. Now we need a movie about someone who's beside him, like Harley Quinn or whatever. Now we need a reboot of Batman. Now we need a remake of Batman. Now we need to put Batman against Superman. Well, you see what I'm saying, right? So this simple story of Batman becomes a huge network of Batman, or not even Batman at all nowadays, because it's a whole universe of Gotham. Again, series about Gotham, etc., etc. This new movie about Joker, which is very well made, by the way, I would recommend anyone if you didn't see it. It's a very good movie. I recommend it. All right. Hopefully, I've provided you the logical basis, like the cultural, philosophical basis, and I've explained how it directly relates to what we observe in the popular culture, in particular in cinema. So, to conclude this rant, we've talked about how networks are nowadays replacing hierarchies, general point. The second point is that we represent usually time in the terms of space, and so in time we can also have a hierarchy, and it's very important in art, especially temporal art like music, literature, and cinema. And in cinema, which I've focused on in this video, we previously had a hierarchy that is some isolated story, pyramid-like story, and since, as per my first statement, hierarchies are demolished, and, well, not as much demolished, but replaced by networks as the main thing in culture. Now we move from these isolated islands of cinematic narratives to cinematic universes. And this easily explains how all these superhero universes arise, how any other sort of fictional universes arise, and even non-fictional, you might say, like look at James Bond, for example, or something like that. Maybe a bad example, but, sort of like, well, okay, it's fictional in the sense that it didn't happen, but it's not like sci-fi or fantasy, you know, in this sense, non-fictional. Okay, hopefully it's understandable. So, as a PS, you might ask, well, what about the future? And I honestly don't know. I don't see what else can replace networks. It kind of looks like sort of like the end, but we don't know yet. Like, probably, maybe, I don't know, maybe something else would replace networks, some other sort of thing. We're just literally too stupid to understand it at the moment. Like, I think like people in 200 years from now would have a much better conceptual understanding of what was going on today. I mean, in our today. But in terms of like at least technical capabilities, like I already mentioned that we have like technical capabilities plus cultural foundation, which is like networks replacing hierarchies, and here large multimedia. So on this side, at least, we can see where things are going. It's virtual reality plus robots. Okay, so maybe at least with this one leg, we can predict what kind of anthropod, or is that the proper word? Anthropoid, I don't know. What kind of thing we would acquire on the next step, alright? So maybe cinema would transform from this like sort of half previous form in the form of like cinematic universes plus TV series into something more immersed in virtual reality plus robotic influence. And like, I don't know, like I'm not like a futurologist or whatever. I'm just a philosopher. I'm just stating what I observe, and it actually seems to work, I would claim, but it's up to you whether you agree with it or not. Alright, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.